Right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm sorry to be a bit late. We're at the Ministry of Economy, and you can't, the ministers like talking and things like that, so we couldn't get away exactly when we wanted to. Anyway, I've been asked to talk about education and entrepreneurship, so I'll do my best. And I'll try hard. Yes, right. So Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. And I believe that. And you're all sitting here, you're being educated, hopefully, and I'm sure you also agree. But it has to be appropriate education. Einstein said learning is not a product of schooling, but the lifelong attempt to acquire it. And it has to be the right learning, because everybody is a genius. Even Einstein thought that. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll spend its whole life believing that it's stupid. In other words, various different people are good at various different things, and they need to be encouraged to reach their potential in those areas. And then Oscar Wilde, the famous playwright and writer, said education is an admirable thing, but it's well to remember from time to time that nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. In other words, you actually learn through life as well as sitting in classes. And we all have two parts of our brain, the left brain and the right brain. And the left brain is the analytical side, does the spreadsheets, does the adding up, does all the calculations, does the logic, etc. And the right-hand side of the brain does passion and creativity and love life and all sorts of good things. And the important thing about education is that both sides of the brain need to be educated. You can have some geeks who are jolly good on the left side. You can have some really creative people who are jolly good on the right side but couldn't run a McDonald's sort of thing. And normal people, you need both sides of the brain to be educated and working. And education is changing. The current system was designed to meet the age of industrialization. And the way we do it now is roughly how in Britain we invented it in the Victorian times 150 years ago. But it now needs to change in a much more complex and interconnected world. Population increase, globalization, resource scarcities, and especially the abundance of readily available information mean we need a new way to educate. If you want to know something, you go to Google or Wikipedia or something. You don't have to necessarily have memorized it in a classroom. And the other key thing is that in the old days, people would work for an organization for 40 years. They'd graduate, they'd go to work somewhere, they'd stay there 40 years, and they'd retire. That just doesn't happen now. People move around a lot. You may stay with the same profession or trade, the same sort of area, but you will move organizations. And so what I'm going to talk about today is three things, really. The use of technology to learn and work, global and cultural understanding, because that's absolutely key as the world is changing, and then creativity and entrepreneurship. And the future is approaching fast. When people sitting here, the main part of the audience, when you retire, it'll be about 2050. The world will be unrecognizable in 2050. If you go back 40 years from now into the 1970s, the world has changed hugely since then, but it will change much more between now and 2050. So let's talk about delivering education. There's a classic shot of a lecture hall. I'm sure not this particular school, but there are many schools around the world that's pretty clear. When I was at Cambridge, I did chemistry, advanced chemistry in my second year. And we used to say the notes of the lecturer went onto our notes without going through the brain of either. And that was what it was like. So we don't want to do that anymore. We need to move from the sage on the stage, which is what I am here, there's somebody standing at the front lecturing, a one-way communication, to the guide at your side, somebody who's actually interacting with you. And you learn the basic concepts now online, and then the contact time needs to be used for questions and to extend the knowledge. because actually having lecturers standing up at the front is not necessarily the best way of using it. Distance learning is coming in. There are some things you can do with distance learning, some things you can't, but the MOOCs, the massive open online courses, have had at least 4 million people sign up for them. Now, lots of people don't actually stay the course and finish the course, and many don't actually go on to do another course. So probably only 10% of those, but that's still 400,000 people who actually are learning something useful directly online. And so the future of education eliminates the classroom, because the whole world is your class. And this goes back to what Einstein and the others were saying. You actually learn through life as well as in the classroom. And in the future, you may all be wearing glasses, doing different lessons, just sitting there and just watching the world in its different aspects. And education is becoming interactive, experiential, practical. It's globally matching young people's digital lives. People, we call them millennials, people who are going into work in the new millennium. They've grown up with technology, don't know what to do without their iPad or their iPhone or their BlackBerry or whatever it is. You see little children walking around 3 or 4 years old with their iPads, playing games. They will grow up with those absolutely as part of their life. And so education now is about simulations and games, living cases, visiting places abroad, study trips, consulting projects, mandatory internships, so you actually have to go work as well as study, and a final project that hopefully pulls it all together. And then what is the content? What is it, if that's how you deliver it, what is it you actually learn? Well, in the old days, especially in business schools, you learnt functional skills. Planning, marketing, finance, accounting, IT, etc. When I was at Wharton Business School, that's what you learned. In the last 20 or 30 years, we've moved on to the human stuff as well. Leadership, responsibility, ethics, teamwork, communications. And that's true whether you're an engineer or a businessman or whatever you are. If you're going to be a manager of any sort, you need to know that sort of thing. But thirdly, you need to know about the outside world. And if you look at the diaries of senior people and ask what did they do last week, you'll find they didn't do much functional skills. You don't find the chief executive doing lots of spreadsheets. You don't find them doing that much communication. What they're doing is talking to the outside world. No organization exists in a vacuum. They're talking to the government or the customers or the suppliers or the local community or all the other people that surround the organization. And it's that skill which is very important. So today, this is our planet, of course, and I think there are 5 key learning areas. Firstly, globalization. Secondly, the fact we still have human diversity. Thirdly, creativity. Fourthly, entrepreneurship. And fifthly, leading globally. So I'd just like to go quickly through each of those, just to show you a flavor of the sort of things which I think you need to know as you move through your education. And globalization has an action and reaction. It's already been referred to the fact I went to Trinity College, the largest and greatest college and richest college at Cambridge. And also Isaac Newton went there. And Newton's third law of motion is that to every action there's a reaction. And the action of globalization means that more economic flows happen between countries and between continents. But there's a reaction. People don't necessarily like it. There's a resistance to the impact of global forces on culture. And actually accepting other cultures is not easy. So if we look at 1750, before industrialization really, that's the population of the world. It's about 800 million people. 63% of them were in Asia. And indeed, Adam Smith, in the most famous economics book ever written, The Wealth of Nations, said China is a much richer country than any part of Europe. And indeed, it was true. Right through history, right through to 1820, Asia was about 2/3 of the world economy. Europe was about 30%, America and Africa are a bit less than 10%, and Western, which is America, Canada, Australasia, with more or less nothing happening there at all economically. But then we had technological change. The steam engine, the steam boat, Faraday with electricity, and cholera and all sorts of things that were invented and found during the 19th century. Even the humble sewing machine changed people's lives a lot. The Ford Model T, the Wright brothers, the Trans-Siberian Railway, and then Einstein and the atom. But that all happened in the West. It didn't happen in Asia. The world population went from 800 million. By 2000, it was 6 billion. It was going up about a billion every 11 years in the latter part of the last century. But interestingly, the world population was still 60% in Asia. Europe was down to 13%, and the Latin America and Africa, 21%. But what happened to the GNP? Because we had the technological change, Asia dropped from 2/3 to 1/5 of the world's GNP. And many people still have that in their mind, that Asia's a poor place. And as you can see, the yellow line moved up as America got organized. The purple line, Europe, kept reasonably well, about the 30–40% mark. And sadly, Latin America and Africa didn't do very much at all. And why has that happened? Or what is now happening since the Second World War? Well, in very simple terms, there have been two key changes. Firstly, physical movement of goods and people. Goods and container ships. You can now send a container from Europe to China for less than $1,000, and you can get a lot in a container. It costs you about $3,000 or $4,000 to get it back again, full of stuff, but getting it out there shows how cheap it is. And of course, aircraft have transformed the way in which we all move around the world. The other side is information movement. Information now flows everywhere. When anybody has an internet access, can essentially get whatever information they want. And so Asia has begun to move up again. And at the end of the last century, it was back to about 40% of the world's GNP. And Europe, as you will see, was going down as a proportion. Between 2010 and 2050, the population of the world will go from about 7 billion to 9 billion. About another billion people in Asia, which is a quarter increase, and another billion in Africa, which is almost a doubling of the population. But interestingly, still about 60% of the people will be in Asia. Africa and Latin America have come up. Europe's getting smaller and smaller. That will be down to 8% of the population. And if one looks at some reasonable growth estimates over the next, between 2000 and 2050, the population numbers are pretty solid. The GDP per capita are obviously estimates, but based on recent and expected history, and that gives you the GDP. And if you just apply those numbers, because of the power of cumulative interest, we find that Asia goes back to over 2/3. Because if the money and the information and the goods and the people are flowing equally, you'd expect the populations to be roughly equally rich. So the first lesson is that's the world that you're going to enter. It's not going to be a European world, it's going to be an Asian world. Because Europe, the States, Canada, and the whole of Latin America and Africa will each only be about 10% of the world's economic activity. So that's the world you're going to prepare for. Indeed, I had breakfast today with a gentleman from China who's looking to invest both in Serbia and the UK and all sorts of things. They've got billions of dollars to spend, and they're beginning to have quite an influence on the West. And it's about free enterprise, because we're obviously emerging from a difficult economic situation. Some countries are emerging better than others, but in every country, it's business which provides the basis for the upturn. It's free enterprise which generates the wealth that then pays for the schools, the hospitals, social security, and all the government other government activities. Governments themselves don't produce money. Somebody else has to produce the money, they tax it, and then they spend it. So that's the economic side. The cultural side. We are still very diverse. All sorts of nations, all sorts of people, and an understanding of this is equally important as understanding the economics. We say in Europe that in heaven, the nannies are British, the cooks are French, the engineers are German, the administrators are Swiss, and the lovers are Italian. Sounds pretty good. But in hell, the nannies are German, the cooks are British, the engineers are Italian, the administrators are French, and the lovers are Swiss. So he just used that very simple example. We all know it's true-ish, yeah? You can't generalize a whole nation, but it's, every nation has its own characteristics. And what is culture? Well, culture is the way we do things when nobody tells us how to do them. Somebody puts a plate of food in front of you, you pick up a knife and fork. You don't look for chopsticks, whereas if you're in China, you'd be looking for the chopsticks, not the knife and fork. Very simple example. Culture is like water to a fish. A fish does not know that water exists until it jumps out of it. So people who only live in one country think that that's all it is. It must work that way, whether it's whatever aspect of the country, the government, the religion, the practices, the marriage ceremonies, that's how you do it. You go to another country and you find they do it completely differently. And so we're all like all others. We all have basic human needs. We eat, we drink, we go to sleep, etc., etc., etc. We're also like nobody else. Everybody in this room is different from all the other people. We're unique in our own right in various ways, either